Are our dreams meaningful?
Okay. So no slow pitch, huh? Um, so first off, nice to see you, Jack. Haven't seen you in a while, obviously. So happy to be back on your pod.
I see you too.
Are dreams meaningful? Yes, I think they are. So if there's a few kind of rough and ready arguments that I would use in this respect. If we sort of consider, a traditional like Hobson level, synthesis activation, your brainstem is just shattering while you're asleep. I don't think that accounts very well for a number of the features of dreams that we see. So, for one, we have reasonably good evidence at this point that, REM, right, is of course implicated specifically in the consolidation of procedural knowledge, right, skills. And what we see, of course, is that when people practice skills in advance of dreaming of some kind, right, you can, especially in sort of, lucid monitoring studies, but those are a funny case. It seems to be a distinct state. So we'll leave that aside. But for instance, somebody practices tennis all day and you're going to see their eyes swishing, or watching tennis, you're going to see their eyes swishing back and forth. And then if you wake them mid dream, they often record, oh, yes, I was sort of practicing this skill. If we disrupt REM in humans and also in mice, etc., we tend to see a lack of consolidation of those skills. More recently, there has been, I think, a reasonably good body of evidence that shows that NREM is also, in fact, a dreaming state. So people used to consider NREM, REM was dream, NREM isn't. And it seems that NREM is implicated in a different kind of dreaming, which is more consistent with the sort of phenomenology of it, which is that it seems to consolidate propositional information. And my experiences of sort of being aware during my NREM, which took quite a bit of practice, were quite different than REM. It doesn't have the same, dramatic sensory kind of quality. Instead, it's like being in a sort of, I don't know, like a vast dark cavern in which you can hear various lines of thought simultaneously. It's quite strange. But so this idea that these two states, right, are in some ways consolidating these different kinds of information seems pretty straightforward. However, there are a few other features that I think are worth looking at. So one is, I'm a proponent at some level of sort of coming out of Ravonsalow's threat simulation hypothesis for dreaming, which is that the machinery of dreaming evolved in order for mammals, basically, to practice right responses to threats. And some of the evidence for this is that you see that children, right, have a disproportionately high number of nightmares. And when you pull, you see these sort of animal states. I think that is, at least in Ravonsalow's original formulation of the threat simulation hypothesis, it doesn't quite track, because the concept of threat is an odd one, right? Threat is highly contextual. Rather, I think that the states exist to model sort of evolutionary opportunity and threat, right? It's not just threat that matters to you. It's also opportunity for, if you're a mouse, food, mates, territory, etc. So you see both being modeled. The interesting thing when that system accepts into the human level, I think, is, for most humans in most places, what are the fields of threat and opportunity? And I would say that the majority of those fields are, in fact, social. It's other humans. So we do have dreams about being chased by a bear or a monster or something of this kind, but most of our dreams seem to be sort of dry run simulations of various kinds of social situations. So if you look at dreams statistically, right, the sort of average dream takes place, in a place with an emotional tone and involves, if you average it, one person and one generalized other, a type, right? And if you think through your dreams, you can sort of think of instances of this. It's like me and my friend are at the fair and we're looking at butter sculptures, and then all of a sudden, a person walks up, and they're typically described in type. It's a woman, it's a beautiful woman, it's a glowering man, it's an old man, right? If you think about that, that's a kind of like minimal social formula test. It's like, okay, me with one other person I know and type. generalized other, right? And testing sort of responses. It's an opportunity to practice the skills that are in some ways most central to our evolved situation, social skills, right? However, there's some other data that I think is interesting. The big one that I think is interesting is if we buy into Hobson's, activation synthesis, your brainstem is just fizzing like a soda, and then your mind interprets it. We would expect that would yield, even if there was a pattern, right, from sort of residual activation from the day, right, the tennis thing, we would expect that it would appear to be noise. And in information theory, it's like signal versus noise. What is the difference between these things? Signal is marked by repetition. And so one of the things that I think is most, I don't hear this discussed a lot, but personally speaking, I consider quite strong evidence is the fact that there are a relatively large number of people who experience repeated dreams, right? They'll have the same dream or variations on a dream repeatedly. That to me does not square off very well with the idea of it being noise. And so therefore, I'm inclined to think that it's signal. So I have a more extensive theory on that, which I'm not going to, you asked me the time and I'm building you a watch, but we can get into that if you want. But yes, I believe that they are meaningful, although I have a somewhat unorthodox view on what the meaning and utility, how one ought to sort of properly interpret that event is. But yes, I believe that they're meaningful, if that's a fair answer.
A couple things. The first, were you doing lucid dreaming, trying to go into different kinds of dream states? Tell me more about that.
Sure. Yeah, I got really into lucid dreaming when I was about 16. So more than 30 years ago now. And, as with most of the other kind of explorations of altered states that I got into in my teens, reading about it initially, I had sort of spontaneous but short-lasting lucid experiences of various kinds and was quite struck by those. But when I sort of discovered the field of lucid dreaming, right, and sort of secondary to the experimentalist, right, establishment of the paradigm for the study, are you familiar with that work? Yeah. Okay. So it's for anybody who isn't. It's a simple paradigm. Basically, it tracks what they basically did was they track rapid eye, and when you're in REM, they hit you with a flash. And provided that you have a little bit of mindfulness training, it helps, or if you have properly honed attention, you note the flash in the dream. That's your cue. You wake up. But then the really brilliant part of those experiments is that they then would consciously control their eye movements in order to basically Morse code across the gap, right? Like sending a semaphore out of the Bardo or something. So that fact where they could basically use their eyes to send a signal back despite the fact that they were generally paralyzed or established. It's like, okay, this is a thing. So when I came across that research, and then more generally sort of the body of work around Western lucid dreaming, the theory around that, the Tibetan work around it, the dream yogas of Naropa and this kind of thing, I was all in for a while with pretty massive enthusiasm. And so there's certainly a series of techniques. Meditation helps enormously, but there's a series of sort of general techniques that you can learn to do it. And I got into it really deeply when I was sort of 16, 17. I dip in and out, but as I do with most things. So I'll go through periods where I'm really very interested in it, and then periods where I'm stepping away for a while. But that initial period was sufficient to really challenge some of my assumptions about what was possible in terms of sort of the endogenous altered states that were available through that space. And I had remarkable, bizarre, sometimes terrifying experiences, but they sort of sketched things out, and then reading around it, reading some of the more traditional materials, I was not shocked, but struck by the fact that many of these things seem to have, at the very least, analogous descriptions, things that were highly suggestive to me. So yeah, I think it's, again, as I said to somebody recently, it's in some ways I'm a dilettante, a perpetual amateur, but certainly I think there's a lot more room to explore there. And Yes, some of the experiences I've had have been remarkable, strange, hard to account for in some ways.
Like what?
Okay. Fair enough. So, well, okay, maybe I'll give you a few short. So, one of the, okay, when people get into lucid dreaming, generally, this is my experience, and I suspect it's from talking to people, they seem to sort of laugh with recognition. When people start to get into lucid dreaming, at first, it's very unstable. It's hard to maintain the state. There are tricks that you can learn that help you ground back into the state. So one that I use pretty frequently, there's one where you're supposed to spin. I never got much luck out of that, but rubbing my hands together for some reason, which I hit on in a dream, seems to ground me out. Whether or not that's a placebo or there's some kind of internal tactile right loop happening that it pulls you back into your dream body, dream hands. I don't know, but it seems to work for me. So yeah. So initially speaking, I did with lucid dreams what everybody did, or what many people certainly do. I flew around and had sex. That's how I have complete power and omnipotence. What am I going to do? Fly around and have sex? Just a mammal. Anyway, but pretty soon flying and sex, well, they didn't lose their appeal, but I decided to, do more interesting things. So, or not more interesting, let's call it differently interesting. So, in one of these instances, there were a few things that caught me early on. One was an experience that I had where I was walking in a sort of a city street, right? Crowded city street, tall buildings, etc. And I'm walking along, and all of a sudden, actually, I'll give you three from this period because they were all striking. I'm walking along, and all of a sudden, I realize, oh, this is a dream, right? I'm lucid. And so I get the characteristic sort of sharpening and brightening, that phenomenological fullness of it, and right, that's the solidity of the dream space. And being I don't know, probably slightly narcissistic 16-year-old or something, I, of course, promptly declared to the dream crowd, I am your new god, as one does, and was shocked when they started to boo me. I was like, what? That's not supposed to, I'm in control here, damn it. And so I think I vindictively flew up and pushed some buildings on them. And this is not looking good for me. Hopefully there's no karmic penalty for killing dream figures. But in any event, another instance that really threw me was I was riding a horse through the countryside, again, as one does. And I realized that the sort of interior monologue, the thoughts I was having, didn't sound like they were coming from my head. They sounded as though they were coming from the sky. And that triggered me. I was like, oh, I'm dreaming. Right. And the final thing it said, is my voice not thunder? And then I kind of came to. So I took the opportunity to canoodle with a young woman that I fancied under a tree. And everything is going great. It's bright. She's beautiful. It's sunny. I'm like, this is amazing. And then all of a sudden, this figure runs straight at me, stabs her with a spear. Fire! And then the scene changes, not because I chose to change, but the scene changes, and I'm in a kind of Alice in Wonderland meets Pink Floyd, exaggerated courtroom, wigged judges and stuff. And I'm in the defendant box, and there are these figures saying, because you have violated the borders of Arcadia, you are on trial. And I'm like, what is happening? I still feel quite lucid. Right. But nevertheless, this was not what I intended consciously at any rate. And I'm sort of thrown, and I'm a bit freaked out by this. Right. They're like, we're putting you on trial, Your Honor. Good morning, Your Honor. And then I was like, wait a second. I don't have to put up with this. I'm lucid. I'm leaving. And so I started to pull up and out, which is how I would describe there's a kind of lifting up and out and a de-resing that occurs when you leave a lucid dream. It's what I mean when I say grounding back in, is sort of like you feel yourself start to lift up and out, or I do, and then you re-embed yourself if you can do it. So I'm like, I'm just going to lift out. I'm going to wake up. I'm not doing this. And so I started to lift up and out, And as I did, all of these figures, these judicial fairies or whatever they were, all saw that I was lifting up and out. They reacted to it and started to rush the box as I was pulling out. And then I pulled out and I woke up. And I was like, what was that? What was that? And I really didn't, I was weirded out by it. The next time that I lucid dreamed, I found myself in my childhood dining room, except that there was this red pillow, tasseled pillow on a kind of pillar or plinth. And on top of it, it had a like a quartz skull, like the Mitchell Hedges skull, not like the crappy Indiana Jones movie skull, but like a human shaped skull, but made out of pure quartz, right? I've been fascinated by the Mitchell Hedges skull for years. A friend of mine and I once vaguely considered, after a few pints, doing a heist because it was actually being held in, at the time it was stored in Waterloo, Ontario. It's like, we could make off with the Mitchell Hedges skull. But anyway, the Mitchell Hedges skull is on this pillow. And, so I recognize that this is an opportunity. And so I go to the skull and I'm like, tell me what happens after death. And then the entire scene was sort of flensed, obliterated away. And I found myself in this howling space. It was quite terrifying. There were no physical reference points. It was like darkness on deeper darkness. And this incredibly loud sound, like a howl or a buzz. I've sometimes compared it to like loud locusts or something. I was in this sort of black space, utterly terrified. And then I dropped out. And for the next little while, every time I tried to enter lucid dreaming, I would find myself dropped back into this black space, which I called at the time the black wind. So that put me off for a little bit. I was like, oh, okay, it's maybe time to back off, like I've pissed something off. Whether or not it's something that has an independent reality or something psychic where I've transgressed a barrier, or like something is, maybe I should just push through this, but I was like, there are other things to do for a bit. The other effect that I recall from that early period, of course, was that my number of false awakenings went up dramatically. And that is, if you're familiar with it, a highly disorienting experience. So I would be taking a nap on the love seat at my mom's house, and I would, wake up and get up and go to the window, look outside. I'm making some toast. I'd look out and be like, oh, it's snowing. And then I would think, wait a second, it's July. Can't be snowing. I'm still asleep. And then I would wake up and I'd be like, oh, that was weird. Like it was basically indistinguishable. That was weird. Okay, so I get up and I go upstairs and I start going to the bathroom and I'm gonna get in a shower and I look around and I'm like, the layout is all weird up. Oh my God, I'm still asleep. And this would happen 3 or 4 times in a row often. The effect of which is obviously like a highly destabilized sense of the reality of things. Like it really monkeys your like native ontology and metaphysics, because you start doing sort of reality testing exercises continuously. And it got me thinking, like, how many of my memories that I think were waking memories were actually dreaming memories? Like, until I noticed the anomaly, it was basically indistinguishable. So, yeah, those were some early experiences. You want me to keep going? I don't want to take up too much time with it.
No, this is great. It's like you alluded to it there, but it made me want to ask, should one do lucid dreaming then? Is it beneficial? Can it be incorporated into, psychodynamic understanding of your deeper self and growth?
Yes, I think so. There's a thread that runs through both the sort of dream yogas of Naropa, but also the general Tibetan practice around this, that if you can sort of learn how to remain conscious within the dream, first off, you can accelerate your practice considerably by doing things like meditation, right? Because you are in some sense, freed from the bodily constraint, right? And so there's this idea that you can accelerate your practice, but also they make claims about being able to remain aware in that state and then eventually learn how to remain basically conscious all of the time across all states. Now, I've never done that, but I've had certainly tastes of it. Like I've become conscious, I've become lucid in REM, I've become lucid in NREM. And there is, I think, something like a peak experience or something, which seems analogous insofar as it's sort of got that phenomenological deepening and sharpening experience that one gets waking. So I have some intimation of that, and I suspect that there is, an inherent value at some level to practicing becoming conscious. On top of that, yeah, there's some interesting literature. They've used lucid dreams with kids and adults for nightmare treatment, for instance, which is, you're being chased about by a monster. And, what you do is basically train the kid to turn around and ask it what it wants. And generally speaking, when they do that, it's almost textbook. The monster will sort of shapeshift to a fairer form and then say, well, I was just trying to get your attention, basically. Um, and like, why does it behave monstrously? Because we run. It chases us because we run. It's monstrous because we are afraid, right? And if we can turn and engage. So there's been interesting stuff with dealing with phobias, right, in a simulated kind of space. I think that there's a great deal of opportunity in lucid dream to do dream practice. But from a sort of psychotherapeutic, I mean, people are pretty variable in terms of their ability in this sense, right? So it's not what I would call a central pillar of the work. But because being able to access the dream space, I mean, I already do quite a bit of dream work in my practice with my clients. It's sort of unconscious dream work is, one of the staples. And I feel that most mainstream psychotherapy sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater on that question. Lucid work has an impressive amount of, I think, utility in the field precisely because when you're talking about psychodynamics and the internal relationship of your various parts, you can summon or instantiate those parts and relationships in the dream space in order to have a quite direct form of dialogue. Now, granted, there are some limitations to that, and there's a whole German school of dream work starting from the 1980s that deals with, fascinatingly, testing the cognitive capacities of dream characters. I did quite a bit of sort of research around this back in the day. And so there are these interesting experiments where basically they trained a dozen or so fairly skilled lucid dreamers that when they became lucid, they would effectively run some like basic cognitive and reasoning and creative tasks with dream characters experimentally. They asked permission. But also, they, effectively speaking, ran something like a Turing test on them, right? The kind of thing that we would normally talk about testing the, is a computer properly conscious or, a computer program. And so they effectively ran something like akin to a Turing test, testing whether or not a dream character has their own perspective and seemingly their own consciousness. And the initial data that they pulled in the 80s was suggestive, but there were replications in the 20-teens that where they split this off. Stumbris did some of this work, but there's a whole German school around it. And I find it quite compelling. It seems to me that, in fact, these dream characters at some level possess their own perspective, their own consciousness. And that's very consistent with psychodynamics, right? This idea that these parts aren't, they are alive. They possess a kind of agency or quasi-agency. They possess consciousness, perhaps less than what we typically possess, but they can have access to their own information. They can have their own goals. They can have their own skills. So yeah, there is some really interesting work in and around that, I find.
On that note, I remember a story of apparently a somewhat schizophrenic patient. Someone would have dreams, but then when they were in waking life, taking form as their dissociated alters, those
Mm,
alters could only remember the dream from certain perspectives. If there was a dog, a woman, a man, then there would be a dream from the dog's perspective, a dream from the woman's perspective, whatever. Which is
fascinating. I've
yeah,
never come across all, but that
yeah.
sounds right to me. Huh.
Um, it makes me then want.
If you happen to have a reference for that, and you want to shoot it to me after, that would be terrific.
I believe I heard Bernardo Kastrup and Michael Levin talking about it. Let me look into it. It makes me want
Right.
to ask more generally about how to think about parts of our psyche. I mean, it's very funny and fascinating when you talked about lucid dreaming, that you wanted to do certain things, and then it's like it's your dreams, but then there's a way in which the dream is not going to let you go. It's not going to let you do whatever you want, and
Oh,
you're the woman you're with is just stabbed with a spear, and it's just can't.
yeah, it pushes back. I mean, being lucid, the thing is, being lucid isn't being omnipotent. It's having a measure more consciousness, which has a certain, effect in the space. But there are limits to what you can do. And, whatever part or parts of our brain slash mind generate these experiences, these spaces, we don't seem to get typically, or at least I haven't, gotten direct access to them. I can get a kind of indirect access, which is um, almost like to borrow the current LLM metaphor, I can prompt, right? But the actual output is typically highly variable. So
Mm.
when I ran a little on my own time, informal replication of some of these consciousness studies, there was an instance where, I found myself walking the streets of an Italian city and I became lucid and it was amazing, right? I just spent a bunch of time looking at the incredible amount of detail and thinking to myself, like, right, my mind is generating this. And I know that it does that on a day to day basis, right? It is sort of painting a great deal of what we think we are perceiving. But it's remarkable in this case where there isn't an external input to be experiencing things that have so much texture, solidity, so on and so forth. So I walked over and walked up to one of these dreaming characters who's walking the street and said, "Excuse me." And they were like, "Yes." I was like, "I wonder if you would be interested in participating in a quick experiment." And they were like, "Oh, sure." And so I ran some of these experiments basically in a condensed form. I had them draw something that I had my back to from their perspective. And so they sat down, drew in the dirt, and drew this church tower thing, which I had walked past, was behind me, right? But that I wasn't looking. And they drew this thing. They were like church. I had them do some arithmetic tasks because they're quite bad at math. Yeah, and then I had one of the weirdest ones. Um, I ran into my sister's eldest child while I was there, and so I asked them to participate in the dream, and I knew they were a dream figure. And I started asking them some of these arithmetic questions, and they could answer, say, in terms of multiplication, all of the numbers. They could easily answer all of the ones that I knew by rote. So we learned rote times tables as a children, right? I don't need to look up or calculate that 7 by 7 is 49. I just have that on hand, right? But as soon as I upped to something that I don't have on hand, I think it was 11 times 13, they started bungling it up. And so I sort of said, "Oh, is it, what's the trouble?" And at that point, they looked at me directly and they said, "It hurts us." And I was like, "Oh, okay, experiment's over." I don't know what that means, but the this experiment, time to take a break on this one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, when you're looking at psychodynamics or sort of parts theory in general, and I think we've talked a bit about this before, some of this to me is very straightforward, and I have a hard time imagining what the counterposition could credibly be. And I recognize that that's a blind spot and a bias on my part. But, one very often sees in people, but also in discussions around sort of mental phenomena, this notion of what I often call the unitive bias, right? This idea that we are singular, right? Individual. Um, and this just seems very obviously not to be the case to me. right? Anytime you've experienced ambivalence, I'm of two minds, or you've simply said, like, oh my God, what was I thinking? Like that pretty obviously seems to indicate there are parts. We know that there are parts of the body, so I'm not sure why we wouldn't think that they're parts of the mind. We know that there are organs of the body, so I'm not sure why we wouldn't think that there would be sort of organs of the mind, right? In some sense. And, coming out of the work that John Vervaeke and I had done a number of years ago around consciousness theory, it seemed pretty obvious to me that the mechanisms of sort of Vygotskian internalization and mutual modeling that we were talking about in those contexts would internalize models. And a model is not a representation. A model is, it behaves like the thing, right? So if you have an internalized version of somebody else, right, that isn't simply, it's not just a set of facts about them, nor is it simply, I don't know, whatever, a recognition, a predictive sense of the behavior. It's an active piece that is attempting to predict them by being them, our version of them. And so I think that internalization in that sense means building people in our head, right? And in turn, my strong suspicion is that that is also what's happening in dreaming, is that we are temporarily dissociating from having a tight integration of those systems with our primary consciousness in order to interact them for training purposes, right? That's, I think, basically what's happening. But the idea that there are these parts and that the parts are alive, right? This is something that Jung captures that is in some ways absent, say, in Freud, right? For Freud, there are parts of the psyche, but his model is very hydraulic, right? It's very mechanical in a certain sense. Whereas Jung comes out pretty early with the idea that these things are in some sense alive. They're organic. And that's an important distinction because what that implies is that they are living things. If they're living things, then at some level they're sort of possibly autopoietic, self-making, they have self-interest, and their self-interest is not necessarily aligned with what you would consciously identify as your self-interest, right? So to me, this is sort of all of a piece. We have internalized people who we know, and we can see that in things like old married couples where their communication level drops, right? Because they communicate less, but they're not losing information. Why? Because they have each other internalized. And if they don't, there's a problem. The assumption when, you go shopping for your partner or you hit the grocery store, it's like you don't have to ask yourself whether or not they want fish sticks. If you know that you're just like, oh no, they hate fish sticks. And you can generalize out from that, right? If you look at gifting patterns, and this is something I deal with a lot in my work, I think gifting patterns rely on this quite a bit. So there's this thing I call kind of the hierarchy of gifts. It's a little tongue in cheek, but at the bottom, you've got gifts nobody wants, like, I don't know, candles, or I don't know, like
Socks.
bath oil. Some people do. People love socks, and we go through them. So, but you get the idea. It's like a completely non-specific sort of gift, the kind of thing you might get in a Christmas exchange from somebody who it was just like a blind choice, right? One up from that, you got things like, I like this thing, so I got for you. I'm into golf, so I got you clubs. I don't know whether or not you like golf, but here you go. One up from that is, I know something about your preferences. I know you like to read, so here you go. I got you a copy of 50 Shades of Grey. They said it was a bestseller, right? Okay. A one up from that is more specific. I know you like mystery novels, so here, I bought you the Da Vinci Code. Okay. That might not be appropriate, but it's getting close, right? Above that, we get things like, hey, I saw that you liked those purple pants, so I bought them for you. One up from that is, I saw you liked those purple pants, so I got you these yellow pants, which I think which I feel you will like. But right up here is sort of the crown jewel of gifts, which is the gift that you buy for somebody that you you may not have any interest in, but that when you see it, you immediately recognize that that thing is a good gift for them. It may be that you've never seen this before. You may have no personal interest in it. They can be completely unaware of it. But you see this thing and you're like, that's a thing for them. And interestingly, when this happens, and some people are better at this than others, but when you give a gift of this kind or receive one, people very often seem to say some variation on the same thing, which is like, wow, I'm so touched. Touched. It's as though you've made contact with them. And if you think about this, this is something I hit a lot with clients in relationships where there's a real gifting differential, right? If one person is a relatively solid gifter, right, good, and the other person is not, you're going to get, this builds up resentment, right? But why? Because it's indicative, I think, of a failure of internalization. So, for instance, many years ago, I worked with somebody whose partner at the time used to get them cut flowers. And the first time this happened, they said, thank you, but I actually don't like cut flowers. And then this person continued to bring them cut flowers regularly, on occasions, repeatedly, despite being told, I don't like cut flowers. What is that? That's a failure to internalize, right? You are not, you're picking something that is in the category generic girlfriend. And it's like, girls like flowers, right? And not updating to a more specific model of, them, right? And so if somebody fails to internalize us, or they succeed in internalizing us, we take this right to be very deep. When we get a gift of this kind, touching, all right? I think the best gift I ever gave was a gift that I bought for John Vervaeke when he got his permanent position, before he got tenured, but his permanent position. And I was sitting and I thought, I should really get John a gift and for this, to mark this. And then all of a sudden it popped into my head, seemingly out of nowhere. It wasn't something I'd ever considered before. And I thought, I'm going to buy John an Acheulean hand axe. And so I went on eBay, and you can buy anything on eBay. And so I looked and I found one out of a late 19th century German collection that had been authenticated for about $50 and had it shipped over. And if you know an Acheulean hand axe, you're familiar? Okay, this is like an early human tool. So they were sort of the most common tool, maybe 1.5 million years ago. Lots of them were made, so there's plenty of them, in various collections and things. But it's kind of like a chipped teardrop-shaped stone that fits into your hand. And it's right on the edge. And it's a rock, but it's sort of like the first tool in some way. Like you can feel that it's a tool when you hold it. It's a bizarre sort of experience. You can tell it's like, oh, this is a made thing. And yet, of course, it's very, very simple comparatively. And so I was like, I should get John a gift. I should get John an Acheulean hand axe. And so I got an Acheulean hand axe. I gave it, box, and he opened it up. And his reaction was extremely gratifying, right? Because he was like, wow. At the time, he told me, and I'm sure that's not the case anymore, but he was like, this is, I think, the best gift I've ever gotten. I'm so touched. And that left an impression. I was like, why? Why are you touched? What just happened there? What are we talking about? Another example of this internalization thing I sometimes talk about is, it's been off the air for years, but there used to be this game show called the Newlywed Game. And the premise of this show was that you would separate the husband and the wife and basically ask the husband questions about the wife, right? And so these would be of escalating difficulty, right? So what's her favorite color? Blue? And if you get that wrong, you sleep on the couch, I guess. But, the idea was, how well do you have them internalized? That, in some ways, is the it's sort of the reciprocal to the old married couple. You're testing their old married coupleness. But what is old married coupleness? Internalization, mutual modeling, mutual internalization. Because within the brain, the theory is that mutual modeling allows areas to coordinate their action without having to constantly send metabolically expensive information, right? That it's bioeconomically infeasible to just have everything talking all the time. So instead, you maintain models in separate locations. Those models model the phenomena in question, right? And then you periodically have to update, much as humans do, because, if you don't tell your wife you hate fish sticks, then 20 years later, when she brings home fish sticks, you're going to explode and say, I don't like fish sticks and I've never liked fish sticks and you don't know me and I want a divorce, right? This is typically a failure to update your priors or communicate things. But the point is, without that, it allows these systems to move with a reasonable degree of synchrony simply by predicting each other's output without having to have constant chatter. I think the same thing occurs between people. So, and at some level, as I sometimes point out, and I have a hard time wrapping my head around, individual neurons and clusters and systems of neurons, right? These tiny machines we build, do not intrinsically recognize the difference between inside the body and outside the body. This is pretty clear if you consider like Andy Clark's Natural Born Cyborgs. I think that is sort of implied there too, which is that for them, the brain is environment. They are in competition with each other for resources, but also form, apropos relative to your research, they form collaboration networks, right? This neuron scratches that neuron's back and so on. But the point is, the brain for them is environment. There isn't a distinction between a signal that comes in from another brain region and a signal that comes in from outside, right? And indeed, those things are in dialogue with each other as we construct our models of how the world works. So to that end, I think internalization in many ways, this mutual modeling form of internalization, forms the basic architecture of sort of human cognition and consciousness at certainly at the social level. And, what we're seeing in dreaming, to loop this back around, I think, is the sort of testing and refinement of that internal system, which then engages, right? We're running simulations of social situations, et cetera, inside. But of course, the inside doesn't know what's inside. It's just data, right?
To see if I understand this, so social situations are very important. So we would make models of other people within our mind to try and predict them and understand them.
Yep.
And then they can come alive when we're dreaming. But so I wonder, so then they're part of us, they are us, but then they're also modeling the outside. Like I hear it in parts work, there are parts of us. So then I'm wondering, what is the other people outside of us, and what is, like, do we have parts of ourselves that is not related to other people outside of us?
Yes, I think so. Although a lot of the things that we think of as ourselves are actually derived from models of other people. So yes, we attempt to model our environment for various kinds of survival reasons, opportunity and threat, right? And we, where the primary locus of opportunity and threat for humans is other humans. It's not that a bear or a tiger isn't a problem, that's worth modeling, but other people are what you really need to navigate, right? For most of us in sort of whatever, civilized circumstances or, So, and this actually starts early. So for instance, one of the things that I point out, right? When you look at theory of mind, okay, in psychology, and theory of mind, pretty well established, we see a couple of things there that are interesting. One is that your theory of mind for other people precedes your theory of mind for yourself. It seems that we model our own sense of having a self, a mind, from theory of mind of others, right? Okay, that's interesting. And then, effectively speaking, I think what that means, for instance, is that you have a highly detailed, right, model of, say, your primary caregivers, right? On average, call it your parents. Those people are going to be the lion's share of your early interactions. You're modeling them. It's important that you model them because otherwise you die, right? So you have those people modeled in your head. For the most part, those models exist in a semi-integrated fashion, right? However, it's interesting to me that such a wide variety of people report the experience of taking on more and more unintentional parental behavior as they grow older. People talk about this all the time. And it's not like I could give an empirical, like, oh, well, yes, 72, but this is a widely reported phenomenon. I have suddenly found myself doing something. So this raises an interesting thing. It's like, when you do all of that internalization of your parents, what are you doing? You're modeling them as a way of predicting them in the world, but you're also absorbing, per Vygotsky, you're absorbing a whole set of responses to situations. How does one behave, right? So as an example, when my niece was little, she was an only child at the time, or pretty young, and every time she sat down on the couch, she would go, oh, ah. And it didn't take me very long to realize that the reason was that she hung around with all old people, right? And all of us were sitting down on the couch and went, ah. So she just picked it up. We could think of lots of cases where kids do this. They internalize and absorb and then model back, and we go, oh, it's so cute. But what's happening there? I think what's happening is that you have a situational repository of all of these behaviors, which are expressed by the model. And when you encounter a novel situation, that's the first thing you reach for. You could theoretically reason through it, but say you suddenly have your own kids, well, that's when people say, Jesus, I'm behaving exactly like my kid, like my parents behaved with me. And it's frustrating for them. So why is that? Because novel situation, right? How do we address it? We pull from the information in the model and integrate it back in. The shift here that you're talking about in part is like, because it's like, okay, it's modeling outside, but it's also interior. And if you look at synchronization and desynchronization in the brain, you can use that as something of a model for integration of systems and dissociation, differentiation of systems. And they're in constant flux, right? Brain areas come into synchrony, right? And that is when they are tightly integrated, and then they go out of synchrony. In different altered states, we see different patterns of connectivity. So for instance, right, psilocybin pretty famously seems to decrease default mode network activity and create alternate connections and routes. And all of a sudden we're experiencing a whole different world, right? Different endogenous altered states also affect this, right? We see this commonly with something as simple and straightforward as standard dissociation. And dissociation, it's one of these words that has become like a bit of a boogeyman, and it can be. Obviously, there are instances where it's a problem, where it's dysfunctional. But it's not, it is a baseline function of the system to dissociate. If you didn't dissociate, you couldn't watch a movie, you couldn't read a book, you couldn't daydream. All of those things require dissociation, right? There is a drifting of the sensory back and a tighter integration with the interior space in some way, right? It's an altered state. If you don't do that, you can't do something like watch a movie, because you can't break away from just the experience that you're seeing light on a screen and those are actors, and like you have to suspend disbelief, right? In a way that your conscious mind knows doesn't make any sense. Like, werewolves aren't real, but that doesn't mean you're not afraid, right? In that circumstance. So basically what I think is, for the most part, these internalized models are, relatively speaking, often tightly integrated in a transparent way with your sense of self. But in certain altered states, including dream, right, they dissociate somewhat. And it's not like they're literally drifting apart. I'm using that sort of metaphorically. But what's happening is that the synchronization connection between them that causes transparency instead drifts apart. And if you'd ever say, what's a good example of this? The first time I was in a float tank, sensory deprivation, I experienced this. So I was there for like 45 minutes and I was aware that I was floating in soup and I was in the dark and whatever. And then all of a sudden, I felt my perception start to shift. And the contents which previously had appeared to me to be internal, right? I'm imagining stuff and I know it's in my head, started to sort of, see, the language here is tricky, but it seemed like it took on an apparent externality kind of situation, right? Like it was outside suddenly. And I felt that transition occur. So that sort of informed things. It's like, as these systems dissociate past a certain point of integration and therefore transparency within the system, right? Instead, they other to each other. If you lower the connection level enough, they suddenly other and are interacting as though they were an external datum. So most of the time, your parents are part of your overall complex, but periodically, right, they're going to separate out, and then perhaps you're having a dream where you're talking to them. And this is a way of testing the model, testing it against a generalized other, testing various emotional scenarios, etc. It's like the capsule version, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just a little terrifying that when I have kids, then they're gonna be picking up on everything I do, and I'm gonna be in their minds, but maybe even too terrifying to contemplate my own parents and them sort of how much they dictate, and you know, you do notice it. I just wonder then what do we need to break away from that, and develop new models? Like, to what degree is it bad versus to what degree is, you know, evolution has taken this path? We have a complex world. We may as well take the aspects of the people around us that were beneficial, helped us raise us, and
So my inclination here is to say that, I mean, yes, it is terrifying, and it should be, right? Like, if you don't understand the responsibility that's involved with children, then you have no business raising, right? And like, honestly, this is not, it's not like I'm the first person to suggest kids are sponges and you have to be careful what you do around them, right? Um, a dear friend of mine once said something that left a deep mark on me. I don't have kids, but you know, I spent a lot of time helping and looking after my sister's kids, and um, you know, Allah willing, maybe I will have kids in the future. But he said this thing to me, and he said, you know, there's something inherently tragic in being a parent. And I said, oh no, inherently tragic. And he said, because no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, no matter how careful you are, you can see them racking up dents. You know, you can see them racking up damage. And like, it's just, it's inhuman. It's impossible to interact with them always in a way that doesn't do that somewhat. So I think having a healthy sense of one's responsibility in that way is really important. Plus, once you know that, you can use it to do super funny things with kids. Not to completely spin this on their head, but you could train kids to do all kinds of strange stuff. I trained my niece to use a Wittgenstein quote every time she got served food. Um, an unusual Wittgenstein quote insofar as the quote was "hot ziggity," an expression that he used the first time when he came to the States because he thought, I guess, it was current American slang or something. But this is a super funny thing to teach a kid to do. My sister could not figure out where she picked this up from. So anyway, in terms of the overall aspect of this, I mean, my take on this is, I suppose, evolution is, you know, evolution and natural selection create systems of accepted kludges and compromises, right? The basic decisions of evolution, you know, you can sort of default to the natural and be like, well, that's the way it's meant to be. But, you know, the human body is clearly, an engineer would go crazy looking at the human body. It's all these crap third class levers, right? We have a shared pipe for air and food. That's stupid, right? You know, we only get 2 sets of teeth. Like, why aren't we like sharks? I should be constantly spitting out teeth and getting new ones, right? And then we would not die of tooth infections. You know, the hip ratio of women is highly compromised, right? Quadrupeds give birth easily, right? Because they can just separate their right. But if you're a biped, then your hips have to narrow. If your hips are too wide, you can't walk or run, which are important to humans. If they're too narrow, then you can't pass a baby head. Like, these are compromises that traditionally and still kill people. Or, for that matter, back pain. If you've ever had lower back pain, thank natural selection. Because an arch, right, an arch, which is the shape of the quadruped spine, is a terrific load-bearing structure. You can make bridges and cathedrals and all kinds of stuff with an arch. But if you take that and put it upright, you don't have an arch anymore. It would collapse on itself. So you have an S. And an S is a terrible load-bearing structure. All of the force gets compressed into the lower part of the S, which is to say the lower back. And lo and behold, We all have lower back problems. So my take on this is like, evolution is a system through natural selection of kludges, compromises, jury rigs, reuse. It is always operating on the basis of good enough. Where that system stops and cognitive evolution begins, right, is, in my opinion, that is the passing of the baton over to intentional self-development. And intentional self-development is about leveraging these meta systems like consciousness, right, to be able to reach back down into the lower systems and work out some of the stuff that isn't working for you. So in many cases, those things are only a problem if they're a problem, which is what I say all the time. Like when you're talking about neurodiversity or something, people will be like, well, they blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, but it's a problem. It's a problem if it's a problem. If it's causing problems, then there's something that needs to be addressed. And I frequently remind people, this Krishnamurti quote, which I'm going to mangle, but it's no great shakes basically to adjust yourself to an insane world. Like, it's no sign of health to be well adjusted to an insane world. And so I'm not necessarily sure in many cases that what people perceive as a problem is a problem. Right? Could just be a problem with society in many cases, right? The point is, if it's a problem, then it's a problem. Okay. So then the question is, well, in what cases do we want to reach down and tweak those systems? Do you want to just sort of blindly internalize and then re-express things? I have to say, it's the twisted sense in which Freud is right. Your parents have been living in your head longer than you have, which is to say that your model of your parents precedes, per theory of mind, your self-model. They've been living in there longer than you have. And that goes a long way to explaining, for instance, why your family's so damn good at pushing your buttons, right? Per Ram Dass, if you think you've reached enlightenment, spend the weekend with your family. Right. So my take on it is this. I'm an experimentalist. I think getting in there, is there a danger to monkeying around with those systems? Sure. Of course there is. Because there are dangers inherent in intentional self-development. But to me, that's, as long as one is being relatively cautious, taking safeguards, not pushing it too much, powerful things are dangerous things. So anything that has power is potentially dangerous. That's what power is. Therefore, if you want to use relatively powerful techniques to intervene and shift these systems, right, to be able to reach consciously down, right, which we all do to some extent anyway, then yeah, there's a risk associated with that. And one needs to have the requisite amount of respect and caution. It pays to do research. You should take it slow. All of those things. And yet, what are the potential benefits in terms of intentional self-transformation? And my inclination is to say they are very high, because these things, in a sense, constitute our consciousness and the universe that we experience. That seems worth having a certain amount of conscious intervention, right? And things that are not quite conscious, the midwifery of the soul.
I kind of wanted to get into how we should go about interpreting dreams. You mentioned earlier, sometimes you often see one person one person that is more archetypal, more general. Why is that? And how should we navigate and understand their patterns?
So, I mean, in terms of that, that little formula, the scene, emotion, one person one person you don't, that is a very blurry, abstract generalization. You can think of countless dreams that do not follow this precise pattern. It's something of an average. But why? I think because that's pretty representative of a sort of, midline average social situation. It's small enough to be an experiment. You plus one person you have modeled well, plus a generalized other, which is to say a category for which you probably lack specifics. And then it's like, okay, and the situation is this, and go, right? Like test, see what happens, right? How do these systems react? In terms of dream interpretation, obviously all of the stuff I'm talking about does sort of plug in when I'm looking at dreams. But I think the key things to remember with dream interpretation, or at least the key things I try to remember. One, I don't see dreams as messages. Many people see dreams as messages from the spirit world or messages from the unconscious, right? It's a message. That's not quite how I see it. I don't see it as having an intentional communicative content in that way, or at least not mostly. I think some dreams may have that, but it's a little fuzzy for me. Rather, I think that it is a real-time experience. What you're experiencing, in a sense, in my opinion, in a dream is being immersed. And this is not a lucid dream or a big dream or any of them other weird dreams, just a standard dream. You're being immersed into the psychodynamic field that constitutes your consciousness. You're being immersed into it. So what you're experiencing, the inner drama of the dream, it's not that it's a message, it's a real-time experience of the dynamics as they are currently occurring. Right? So there's still data to take from that, in a sense, right? You can still pull lessons out of it. It still has things that are relevant to your situation to say, but it is not sort of delivered to you with an idea that, like, here's what you need to figure out. It's not like that. Rather, it's an immersion into what's happening, and thus interpreting it can tell you a lot about what's happening for you, right? Including what's happening for you in systems that you do not have immediate, easy access to, consciously speaking. So that's one. It's not a message, it's an immersion, right? Two is it's extremely important to remember that dreams and dream symbols are transjective, which is to say that they point outwards and inwards simultaneously. Now, there is some difference of bias or weighting in that area. So, sort of Jung's sort of foremost, disciple, Marie-Louise von Franz, right, famously said, yeah, they point both ways, but 80% in, right? It's mostly in. I don't know. That might just be their bias on the basis of the fact that they're like an introvert interested in this stuff, right? However, I do find that people tend to default to the external interpretation. They have a dream about somebody and they conclude it's about that person, right? And so a lot of dream work is about trying to get this transjective sense of like, okay, but let's remember that person wasn't there. You are playing every part, unless we want to radically alter our metaphysics, right? If all of a sudden we go to another dimension and interact with actual beings or something, all this is, well, maybe not out the window, but you'd have to tweak it. The point is, it's the inwardness of the dream, right? That the inward facing aspect, that is relevant. And in that sense, it's like a constant reminder, right? For both me, in my own dream work, me and doing dream work with clients, and to them, it's like, you are playing every part by definition. So what are these parts? What are they? So let's say that you have, I don't know, a kid that you went to in grade 7. You knew this kid in school. You haven't thought about them in years. And then all of a sudden you have a dream that you're by a waterfall and you're standing with that person. Well, is it about that person? No. You may be interacting with your internal model, but what does that person mean? How do they best represent whatever it is that you are in some sense interacting with? Also, there are things that you could do like, well, the last time you interacted with them in grade 7 or whatever, where were you at? What was your circumstance, right? So it does reflect back to you in the dream, in the sense of like, if you're standing at Niagara Falls, it's like, well, how were things the last time you were at Niagara Falls, right? There's a bit of a reference backwards in that way. But also it's, what is this person to you? And some of that, right, is easy to get at. People are like, oh, well, that person stands in for this. They've always been the person for me that whatever means this thing. Oh, they're the person I knew who was ambitious, or that person was an asshole to me, or that was somebody who got my friends turned against me, right? You can learn a lot that way. But the third principle is, and this is, again, it's a very sort of Jungian, neo-Jungian principle, which is this principle of specificity. So dream symbols are specified. And so, in a kind of Freudian context, you'd be like, well, I was going down the corridor and then I picked up a knife. And not to be unfair, but it's like, a knife, eh? Long, thin, penis. You picked up a pen, penis. You picked up a wand, penis. Right? And that's something of an unfair characterization, but you get what I'm getting at. The idea is that the symbols as they appear within the dream are meant to collapse down to some underlying thing. In Jungian interpretation, rather, you look at that specific. So if you have a dream that involves scissors, why scissors? Why not a knife? Why not a sword? Why not a chainsaw? Why scissors? Right? The scissorsness is a specific thing. And so that principle of specificity in interpretation, I often reference a couple of things. I reference poetry and I reference animation. So the animation piece is just this. If you're watching an old Hollywood movie, Ben-Hur, for instance, Cast of Thousands, right? You'll see some Romans walking by and one of them has a wristwatch. That is an accident, right? They didn't mean to have a wristwatch. It was just somebody fucked up. Somebody didn't take off the wristwatch. And so there's a wristwatch in the shot. But if you're watching animation and somebody walks by with a wristwatch, this is not accidental. Somebody drew the wristwatch. It's specific. Dreams are more like animation than they are like film. You don't get accidental details for the most part. Things were specific. The second aspect of this is it's a bit like poetry insofar as, think about a bon mot, right? When you hit exactly the right word, right? Poets excel at this. They excel at finding just the right word in a way that prose is sort of sloppy. I mean, I write mostly prose. I write some poetry, but prose can be sprawl all over the place and use extra words. And it's good for things, right? But poetry has that intense specificity. So a lot of the time I lead my students rather through this exercise. I'm like, okay, let's do a little bit of simple poetics here. So I'm going to tell you a shitty poem, and then we're going to do a bit of interpretation. So here's a shitty poem. My love for her is an eagle. Okay, that's not a great poem, right? And it's sort of like, huh? What? Okay, what? But try this. Eagle is the specific here. So start substituting nearby members of the category. My love for her is a vulture. My love for her is a hummingbird. My love for her is an owl. My love for her is an ostrich. My love for her is a blue jay. My love for her is a raven. My love for her is a crow. Do you feel it? Can you kind of feel the distinction of the specificity, right? If you say, my love for her is a vulture, that means something quite different than my love for her is an eagle. Then you go back and you look at comparison of class and you say, okay, so what is the eagleness of eagle? Like, why eagle? Why an eagle and not a vulture, right? How does the eagle differ, right? And the idea is, at some level, the dream symbols have this sort of ultra, hyper bon mot quality. They are encapsulating a variety of different meanings into a very compressed space. And really consciously, we're probably only going to be able to tease out certain aspects of that, which is why dreams tend to be relatively inexhaustible, symbolically speaking. You can come up with an interpretation, but you shouldn't hold it too tight, right? Because it may, in fact, angle different streams, right? So it's sort of finding the emotionally resonant piece. And this is why you get a bit of a paradox in dream interpretation, which is the classic thing. One, the analysand is always wrong is an expression you get, meaning the person who had the dream is invariably wrong about their dream, right? Because they have an ego-oriented interpretation. They often miss the point. This was true for me. I used to regularly go into analysis with my dreams, and when I would start to roll it out, my analyst would scoff and say, "You're being a facile extrovert." Right? Because I wasn't thinking in the interior. It's a hard habit. But also, weirdly, when you are playing with dream interpretation, you also wait for the one that really, oh, whoa. And people do have that experience. In fact, early on when I was in analysis. I went for a few months at first. And then I went in one day, I lived about 10 minutes away. So I could basically roll out of bed, cull half the cobwebs off my face, and stumble straight in, no coffee, nothing, which was quite conducive to doing this kind of work, as you would imagine. I went in one morning with a dream. I had no clue. I was like, what? Like, I sat down, and so I lay out this dream and I say, like, what are we doing? What is this? And my analyst loved doing dream work and was exceptionally good at it. And he immediately went, oh, was pulling it out. And I sat there and it clicked and I was like, oh my God, like, A, that, I want to learn that. That thing that you just did, that's impressive. And so it was like it was the first experience I had of having somebody do dream analysis where it wowed me. And it was immediately obvious, and anybody that does this work knows that it's not uncommon at all for you to sort of work around an interpretation. And then when you hit the key point, people are like, oh my God, how did I miss that? And it's because the ego orientation and other pieces of us, right, sort of maintain blind spots. They curve us, they bias us, they skew us, they tilt us in certain ways. So getting the twofold of interpretation, right, bouncing it off somebody often is a way of sort of seeing the back of your head, as it were. So there's that specificity piece, but it requires a bit of practice. The skills involved are tricky. You have to be transjective with a weight to the subjective. You have to bear in mind specificity, and you have to, in my work anyway, shake off the notion that this is like a telegram that's handed to you, and instead get the notion that what's happening is that you're dropping into the dynamics of your own cognition in some way. So, yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. It is. Do you find that it's easier to understand dreams when you first have them, or can you look back on them and it's easier? I'm wondering, short term versus long term, how we think not just about dreams, but understanding our own inner world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things here that I would say is that, as is the case in general with the psychotechnology of literacy, literacy is a wonderful feedback loop bootstrapping system, right, for preserving thought. We don't think about it that way because it's everywhere, but in part that's what it is. I can go pick up a book and I can read Aristotle's thoughts, right? I can telepathically commune. It's the same thing with our own writing, right? So one of the best things you can do for dream work, of course, is starting a dream journal. What I recommend to my clients, a lot of people have a hard time waking up and writing, or even waking up and up their phone. So I actually recommend that people take voice notes. When they wake up, the dream is fresh, voice note it, right? Because it'll blow away like a handful of powdered spices a lot of the time. The more you do that, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's the attention devoted to dreaming, but it's very commonly reported, and certainly within my experience, that when you start to pay attention to the dream space, do not gaze over long into the abyss, for the abyss gazes also into you. Like, it seems to be responsive. And so your dream recall goes up, but also there seems to be a kind of exchange which happens with the unconscious space where an agreed upon language starts to concretize. But regardless, I recommend people keep dream journals. Sometimes I've been doing this long enough that it's not uncommon, while I'm still sort of drifting in, the hypnagogic halfway house between dream and whatever, I'll be doing preliminary interpretation before I wake up. And so then often that goes in, right? Like, maybe this is this, maybe this is this, right? That's, I think, pretty common. It's difficult to keep the details fresh unless it's like a real smack in the face dream. So recording it seems to increase recall, but also allows you to look back on it. And certainly I've had both experiences. I don't know what the weighting is, right? Some have been like, I've had plenty of dreams that, if anything, seemed a bit on the nose. The first time I was teaching the course Hypotheses of the Unconscious, I was getting to the week that dealt with inner parts, and specifically the inner feminine, okay, and dream work. And so fine. So I have this dream, have this dream that I'm fleeing through sort of a void of starry space with no ground, but somehow I'm running with this sort of this beautiful Japanese woman who had a vaguely like, I don't know, kind of kimono, vaguely geisha-esque kind of appearance. And she and I are fleeing through space. And we're fleeing from this like 1,000-foot tall, naked, headless woman with monster lobster claws. Right? To tip of the hat to Jordan Peterson, I guess, there. But the point was, this clack thing is chasing after us, this titanic, headless, abyssal sea monster, Tiamat woman is chasing after us. And here I am fleeing with the, the othered Anima something through space. And we're running and I woke up from that dream and I woke up laughing, despite the fact it sounds like a scary dream. I woke up laughing and I literally said out loud, okay, I get it. Like laying them on a little thick, aren't we? And promptly took that in to that class. When I taught it the first time, I was like, before we start, I got to tell you this dream that I just had. So sometimes they really hit you. I've had that happen lots of times where it seems to be, in some sense, a fairly kind of direct commentary on things. But it has also been the case that looking back over older dreams, especially when I link them up with what was going on, that sometimes I look back and I'm like, how did I not get that these two things were related? Like that I was, sort of boiling in the oil of this issue, and that's the dream that I had. And so sometimes in retrospect, that othering effect, it's a little bit like the effect you get with your analyst, except it's with yourself.
Yeah.
It's like, Jesus, how was I so blind to this? Like the link seems very clear.
That lobster woman dream, what did that mean to you?
Well, I mean, so it meant a bunch of things. Yeah, I was teaching this course for the first time, and the course was kind of my baby. So I had done teaching at university before that, but primarily teaching some of my own material, but teaching a lot. This was the first course that I had designed from the ground up. And I had designed it to do specifically, we were covering a lot of ground, as you might expect. And so we were talking about dreams and dream spaces and the interactions of these spaces. And we were just about to talk about the relationship to the contrasexual soul image, as Jung calls it, right? The anima or animus and questions around that. And how did I interpret it? It's like, yeah, I'm running with my anima across the cosmos, call it the unconscious or whatever you want to call that. And I'm fleeing from the devouring mother, right? And so how did I interpret it? I was like, is this part of my psychodynamics? Well, it kind of is, because it inevitably is, right? That would be Jung's take. This is slaying the dragon to get the princess, is taking out the devouring mother in order to win the life principle. And the anima theoretically pulls you forward into life, right? Not to get too cis-head on this whole thing, but, would men do anything if there weren't women?
Right. So there's a deep...
Would people bother making, some people would. Some people are intensely self-motivated. But, there's an old joke. Is it George Carlin, maybe? Who's like, why did they build the pyramids? They did it to impress a woman. Of course they did. And I don't think that's literally true. But I think that it's very often the case, right? That in some sense, the pursuit of the feminine, and that's not just about sex, it's about what it stands in for in your relation to the world, right? Is the thing that pulls you forward. It's the thing that makes you want to achieve. This is a big subject, dealing with the contrasexual soul image and the feminine and so on. But yeah, I basically read it that way. And in that sense, it was like, the symbols were really like blunt, giant, headless, naked woman with lobster claws is about the most kind of like Tiamatic, to coin a terrible adjective. It's a very direct kind of symbolism, right? For like the devouring mother and the ancient sea and this kind of thing. I suspect that there are elements too. The fact that it had lobster claws, this was before, Jordan was the Jordan B. Peterson, the Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. he was more of a local rock star at the time, and I knew him, and I did events with him and did lots of organizing. I have always been aware that he and I play in similar fields with somewhat different takes. And so probably there was an element of that rolled in there too, which is like, I am taking on this thing. I'm about to go and do this lecture, which is a new kind of thing, and it's really getting at material. And it gave me personal material. In that sense, it was a gift, but also it was like a very clear instantiation of a kind of dynamic that Jung actually talked about. This dynamic between the devouring mother and sort of the princess, and right there's a like Edward Said Orientalist kind of exoticism, right? Which again, I guess my unconscious was being mildly racist against lobsters and Japanese women, but the point is, right, that stands in a very specific way. So yeah, so hell,
No,
I could probably find the recording, because in the recording, obviously, I'm like unpacking it in real time. And being like, so here's this dream, and let's talk about, this dream that I just had. But it was a striking example, and I've had that happen many times.
tell me more about the anima, or maybe even Carl Jung's model of the self, and trying to understand how to conceptualize the parts of us and our journey in life.
Okay. I mean, let me frame that with a caveat, which is to say that I'm a neo-Jungian. I'm not an orthodox Jungian. Now that doesn't mean that I think that those models are useless. I don't. It's just that I think that there is distinct room for theoretical refinement, and there are parts of it. 50% of everybody's work is wrong, almost guaranteed. Isaac Newton was a towering intellect. He got a lot of things wrong, unless it turns out later that we flip it and he got them right, because science is fickle in that way. Einstein, a genius, wrong about things, So I don't typically kind of canonize Jung, and I have known some Jungians and some sort of Jung enthusiasts who really have this kind of like, the collected works are, like a sacred scripture text that may not be challenged, right? And I'm not convinced that that's a helpful framework. I tend to look at it as like, no, I think he was an insightful guy with a lot of personal foibles, and he hit on some important things, but I take it as a given that a bunch of that is probably incorrect, right? Or at the very least that I don't agree with it in terms of my own whatever. So all that aside, does that mean that it's useless? No. In the same way as Newton's laws, right? The laws of motion and stuff aren't useless. We still teach them, even though they are technically wrong, right? They're technically wrong. Einsteinian relativity throws it. They are technically incorrect, but we still teach them because they're a reasonable approximation for common situations. So a theory can be highly imperfect, but still provide a certain amount of structural utility and categorization. That's my caveat. With that in mind, what's Jung's system? So, Jung bounces off Freud. For Freud, we've got, there's the ego, and above the ego, you've got the superego, and below the ego, you've got the id, and they're in a kind of hydraulic tug of war, right? They're trying to pull this in each direction. This represents, exterior finger wagging and social restraint, repression, self-regulation mechanisms. And this represents your appetites. And if this sounds like the model proposed by Socrates, it's because it basically is, right? Which is to say, we have three parts in the soul. There's the beast and the lion and the man. And if you're lucky, the man and the lion team up to control the beast. I mean, that's basically Freud's model, right? If you're lucky, you can kind of team up with your superego, not get crushed by it, right? Or nagged to death, scolded to death, right? And you can use that to keep your id in check, because it just wants to run around like Captain Caveman, slavering and eating and screwing and, right? Whatever. So Jung breaks from this a bit. And Jung, first off, the kind of point that people are probably familiar with is, okay, you got the ego. And what's the ego? The ego is sort of the locus, the center of your internal experience, right? And then there is a counterpoint to that, which is the shadow. right? And the shadow is the reason he talks about shadow work as being sort of the start, the apprentice piece for doing this kind of work, is that despite the fact that it's difficult to do shadow work and inexhaustible, you never end, it's actually relatively easy to access. But sometimes you'll even access it spontaneously, right? In the same way as your shadow is always sort of attached to your feet, right? You can't get away from it. We do try to get away from it routinely. And so a good sort of metaphor for this is there's a scene in Peter Pan where Peter decides to cut the shadow off his feet with silver scissors. And he does. And the shadow goes running around the room, having a grand old time, but Peter starts to get sick. And the other kids have to grab the shadow, catch it, and stitch it back on. We don't get to separate from it, right? But there is some trade back and forth because the ego is the locus of consciousness. There is the question of being able to bring things into consciousness and conscious identification from the shadow. So the shadow, broadly speaking, is, when we talk about the shadow, we talk partly about the golden shadow, which is all the great stuff that's in there that you left behind. So, you used to draw pictures and maybe you were pretty good until your teacher came around and said, why are you wasting your time with this garbage? You should go to STEM, and crumpled it up or you did, right? But the point is you used to have this potential and then you pushed it away. You'll see this a lot, right? With self-identifications where people be like, I'm an art person, not a math person, or I'm a math person and not an art person. One of them is me and the other is not me, right? And that can shift. Often when we hit crises of development, one of the things that we can do is go back and dig through the shadow and see if there are pieces that are underdeveloped that we, didn't really let live, right? And that can often be the sort of green shoots, the new energy and stuff, right? Where we come with a new conception of ourselves because we're tapping into something we didn't before, right? So if you threw your art away at 12 and suddenly at 30 you're feeling really empty, reconnecting with that can actually be quite dramatic for people, where it will open up an entirely new field in their sense of being. That's the golden shadow. But the shadow also contains all of the aspects in the world which in the binary you reject. So it's the locus of your projective hate, your projective fear, your projective disgust, right? If you say, I'm not that, and that is bad, then that thing is the shadow. It's in the shadow, right? And that explains things like the corollary to love at first sight, hate at first sight, where you meet somebody and you fucking loathe them, right? But with no good reason. You don't know them. And I've had that experience more than once, except that my MO has now become to make the approach. If I have that immediate sense, I take it to be, okay, I'm experiencing a shadow projection for whatever reason. Hi, I'm Anderson. Let's go get a beer. And that has actually yielded me some of my closest friends. My initial reaction, which was, I hate you and I want you to die, right, was like, that's not rational. I don't know them, right? So, okay. So these potentials that's not me. And you can see that in all kinds of ways, right? Not me, not me, not me. Then there are the things that you have done, but you've not used. These are the spontaneous shadow aspects that you might encounter at 2 a.m. when you're looking in the mirror and you suddenly realize what a, like morally horrific piece of garbage you are. Basically, you have that feeling, right? Where you're like, oh no, like I am vaguely monstrous for this reason or that. That too is shadow work. It's things that you have done, but don't want to take ownership. You don't want to identify it ego-wise. So that's in there. And then lastly, of course, are all of the potentials you don't want to admit are your potentials. And that certainly gets into sort of the collective shadow territory. Jordan talks about this pretty often. So when Jordan says something along the lines of like, you too could, I shouldn't do imitations, that's rude. You too could be a Nazi. Basically what's he saying? Well, he's saying that, under the right circumstances in a parallel universe, you might have the jackboots too, right? And so some deep forms of shadow work are confronting that. And that is a soul blasting experience, right? To recognize that, under the right circumstances, you could be truly monstrous, right? But it's an important thing to understand because if you don't acknowledge that fact, it's much more likely that you'll disown anything that looks like that. That's not me. That's not me. No, I couldn't have done that, right? And they all have sort of variable access to our memories in some sense. And frankly, we're all shitty sometimes, right? Because we're human. So shadow work. So you got ego, you got shadow. You can cycle material between them. Above the ego, in some sense, above, okay, this is all a model. Don't eat the menu. The map is not the territory, but as a set of handles to grab. Above the ego, you've got the persona, okay? The persona is literally a mask. The persona is the space that socially mediates the ego and the world, okay? And when I say mediates, I mean it. It goes both ways. It's an interface. So it's a little bit like clothing. When we put clothing on, we are concealing ourselves, right? It's a bit Heideggerian, conceal and reveal simultaneously. We conceal ourselves, but we also use it expressively, right? With the appearance that we give, we use to convey things about ourselves, right? So, I've been wearing these for a long time, or some variation of them. It's basically just become part of my face, right? But clearly, like, what am I riffing on? Well, I don't know, my dad, John Lennon, Jung, right? Like, there's a reason here. And I use this to signal certain Harry Potter, maybe. There's a reason that I do this. I use it as a form of signaling, as we do with our clothes, right? But at the same time, the external world imposes certain things on our persona. It imposes, for instance, gendered qualities, right? So if we are socially perceived to be male, the expectation is that we are going to present in certain ways. If we move into certain kinds of professional roles, right? The idea is that we're going to present in certain ways, right? Part of the process often of entering a profession is the process of gradually internalizing, right? The codes and forms of social behavior, the mask that is expected of us, right? We learn to act like, right? And this is also, I think, the root of imposter syndrome, which is to say, if we're sort of in the zone of proximal development, right, the Vygotskian zone of proximal development in terms of our behavior, we're always pushing a little bit. And if our affect is high, we feel like we're on top of it. Hey, I'm doing the mask real good. But if our affect drops just a little bit, all of a sudden we feel like we're fakers. And the thing is, we are fakers, right? Because Vygotskian internalization is a fake it till you make it kind of thing. You take on the behaviors with increasing refinement until such time as they become a smooth and indiscernible copy, in a sense, of the behaviors that we were meant to take on, right? So if you want to act like a lawyer, you act like a lawyer. If you break that script, people will be weirded out, right? Doctor, judge, all kinds of things, right? Age has certain behavioral expectations. Gender has expectations. Culture has expectations. We have expectations on the basis of context, right? There are certain ways you are meant to behave in a classroom or a church or a restaurant, or right. So all of this is exterior and forms part of the mask, but then the mask also mediates between ego and world. We make decisions about what we show people. Now, some people get to a place where they're like, well, I just want to interact without a persona. And typically, in my experience, that's not healthy, actually. If you behave the same way with your grandma as you do with your lover, something is off, right? It's not appropriate to behave the same way with both of those people. And this is something I occasionally encounter when I talk to somebody who's got a yen on for radical honesty. It's like, well, maybe this is too harsh, but I was talking to somebody about radical honesty once, and they said, well, that doesn't seem blah, blah, blah. And I said, I got to be honest, I think a lot of the people who purport to be doing radical honesty are just using it as an excuse to be an asshole. Like, right? And then you can point at it and say, no, what I'm doing is ethical because I'm being a jerk to you, right? That's the thing I see sometimes. So radical honesty is this notion of total transparency. I'm not convinced that total transparency is necessarily good. You want to have a variety of personae, but also it can be the case that your persona, right? You can have problems there. If your persona sort of fuses with your face, right? If the mask fuses on, then you'll get a situation where you say, well, tell me about yourself. Who are you? And the person will say, I'm a lawyer. It's like, well, kind of like you do lawyering, But how central is that to your identity? So people will fuse with aspects, right? I am a, family relations. I am a son. I am a lawyer. I am a this. I am a that. And if it fuses, then you get a kind of inflexibility, but also it hollows out some sense of authentic experience, right? So that's one problem. Another problem is it could be fractious, right? They could be swapping or chaotic in a way that is dysfunctional, right? It's only a problem if it's a problem, but if it starts causing problems, then it's a problem a lot of the time. Okay. And then the corollary to that, okay, on the other side, is the contrasexual soul image. In Jung's original theory, men have an inner feminine, women have an inner masculine. I think that as, we've seen sort of better science and, better social science and, sort of the voicing of queer culture to some extent, that has come under a great deal of scrutiny. So I know a number of queer Jungians, for instance, who, have all sorts of different positions here. Some of them say, well, all of us have an anima and an animus. Personally, my take is this. I think that it is structurally very similar to the persona, except it faces inward. It's about mediating your relationship to the rest of the unconscious in the way that the persona mediates relationship to the rest of the external. Consequently, I think it sort of absorbs the content which is rejected from the persona in a similar way to the way that the ego and the shadow split between them, right? You can have interchange between ego and shadow. Things can be lost and forgotten, repressed, whatever, or they can be pulled out and made conscious, right? And integrated. So you have a constant exchange, right? But when something is rejected from persona, I think it tends to charge into the ego. And that plays strongly at some level into people's sort of sense of, say, the gender binary. A person who identifies as masculine, and here is how you behave. This is what it is to be a man, right? Well, then that person is going to have correspondingly an opposite, which is the notion of the feminine, right? And they're going to go in for, I don't know, trad wife culture or something, right? Like, so the point is that there's a separation here between it. Again, it's like, well, what I don't put out into the world is what is characterized at the interface of the interior. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's just my personal take. I don't know that this is like a resolved question. And again, don't eat the menu. Map is not the territory, but it's useful to sort of think sometimes with these terms. So that relationship, so let's say anima in my personal case, right? Anima. Well, what does that mean? Like most complexes, right, which are attached to these sort of archetypal structures, that can very easily project into the world. So when you have a love at first sight moment, we would interpret that normally as anima projection. You see a person and suddenly they are the absolute epitome of what you find desirable in a woman, right? They glow. And you will get, right? And your thoughts start to become obsessive and strange and all sorts of things, right? Love at first sight is no different at some level than hate at first sight. You don't know them, but you might feel like you do. And think about the magical experience of wandering around, like a date with somebody where you end up wandering around till 4 a.m. talking, and people will say things of the form, oh my God, I feel like we've known each other forever. And right, soulmates, twin flames, all of that stuff. It's all projective to some extent. Not to overgeneralize, again, but, there are some patterns that you see when that projection starts to rupture, break down. So, again, I don't want to overgeneralize this, but a thing that is a reliable enough average that you can get a laugh out of a classroom of people with it, which is actually not a bad metric. If people all laugh with recognition, that typically says you've hit something. So it's this. A lot of the time in my experience, men project the idealized other. She's perfect. She's perfect. She's perfect in every way. And then gradually, as they start to update their priors and examine this, it's like they're wearing holes through a costume, and suddenly they realize, wait a second, you're not a goddess. You're just a human who poops. This isn't what I signed up for. And they get super pissed about this, right? It's weird and unreasonable. And some of them will do tyrannical things to enforce the illusion, right? To preserve the illusion in some way, shape, or form. A lot of the time, what I see women doing is a different form of projection. And it's a form of projection that is not present-centered, but future-oriented. And so they seem more able to perceive flaws, things that they don't like, but they operate under the, frankly, often erroneous belief that they'll change those things. Yeah, well, this and that and this are an issue, but I'm going to change that. And then, of course, when that turns out not to work, then they, in turn, are disillusioned, right? So that projective aspect of things is part and parcel of the romantic. But that isn't the only place that the anima shows up. In some sense, the claim would be that the anima or the animus, right, this contrasexual soul image, because it's mediating through the unconscious, not only is sort of the psychopomp and the waiter at the threshold for the inner world, right, in some ways, but also mediates the sense of like meaning and purpose and drive. And in some semi-biologically reductionistic sense, we can look at this and be like, yeah, like, of course, the sex drive, right? Of course, the drive to find the paired other is driving us, because if it didn't, we would have gone extinct a while ago. And this game has been playing right back to the first bacterium. So what, let's call it 2 billion years. So, like, at some level, of course, connecting with that energy. But again, what does that mean? And if we roll in a bunch of stuff around mutual models, etc., right, all this modeling stuff, like, I think at some level we have a semi-idealized sense of the feminine, for instance, right? If we happen to be straight and male, and that is what finds hooks on people to hang itself on, and can in some ways be, it mediates the inner experience, and it mediates the kind of relational experience in that sense, but also what? But also there is a possibility of a more direct encounter with it, separate from the projection aspect. And that's kind of what Jung is talking about when he's talking about the inner marriage. The inner marriage is about finding a relationship to this piece without vomiting it onto people nearby. And in turn, right, I've played with this stuff a lot. And it turns out that some of the things that struck me as being obvious in my 20s, like, oh, I'll just not project, turns out to be a disaster. Oh, I'll just have the inner marriage. I did that experiment, and it yielded what the alchemists call a false conjunctio. It breeds monsters. And then I had to unravel the whole thing, basically, because it's like, oh, no, I got way ahead of myself here. So it is possible to develop this inner marriage relationship, which is the relationship to that faculty within oneself without simply projecting it and locating it in the other, if that makes sense, right? And then past that, I know this is a lot. Past that, if we go past, then we're into the deep wild. Then you're into all kinds of other archetypal experiences, right? And, you know, what's out there? I don't know. The trickster, kings, magicians, lovers, broadly construed. You hit sort of the Mercurius experience, which is an interesting one. I often direct people to the Rick Veitch comic book, Rare Bit Fiends, issues 22 through 25, for a really excellent version of this encounter with Mercurius, the paradoxical son of God and the devil. And then past that is self experiences. And self experiences, I mean, they're funny, right? They present in numinous language, the sacred, the profane, and the weird, right? The three languages of the numinous, in my experience. And you know, they're indistinguishable from an encounter with something powerful, whether or not they are. And as Jung says, any encounter between the ego and the self is inherently humiliating to the ego, because the ego thinks it's in charge, and it's not. And so you get kind of smacked down. We're all a little too big for our britches when it comes to, it's a little bit like geocentrism. That's the example that I use sometimes. If you want to believe that the Earth is the center of the solar system, then predicting the movements of everything else in the solar system is really hard, right? This is the the classical kind of view of things. And then we get, the Copernican view, which is, Copernicus never said the sun was at the center. He didn't contradict the church. What he said was the math is easier if you act like the sun is at the center, right? And in that sense, actually, he was correct, right? More so than Galileo, who just came out and said, no, it is at the center, because Galileo was wrong. Again, Einstein, there is no center. It's relative. You pick a center and then you run calculations from that center. But if you pick the sun as the center, well, all of a sudden, all the planets move in nice orbits. Now, does that mean if we treat the metaphor, Earth is the ego, sun is the self, does that mean that we go live on the sun? No. The Earth still has its role. The ego still has a place. It's where we live. It's important. It's populated. But figuring out what the appropriate relationship is, figuring out that the local big gorilla in the room is the self, and everything is orbiting that in a system. And it's a sine qua non. It's a without which not, right? If the sun is gone, the rest of the system just flies apart. We drift off into the cold of space. So, it's a without which not that all these pieces are in orbit, but figuring out how to make sense of the motions of the various parts of the psyche is a hell of a lot easier once you realize that the self is actually sort of the constituting element of that system, not the ego, which is just one more piece in orbit, as it were.
So are we the self, or I guess we'll feel like with the ego is us as well, but the self is loads of different parts, but then again, we're not all our parts all the time. Tell me a bit about what the self is.
Yeah. I mean, so the standard description of the self is that it is the center and the totality of the psyche. That's a confusing idea, right? It's the center and the totality. But I think that if you use this sort of solar system metaphor that I've laid out, it's a little easier to understand. The psyche, has this center, which is the center of the psyche entire, whereas the ego is merely the sort of center of the conscious field. In a sense, it's where the spotlight is the brightest, conscious field. A little bit like Bernard Barr's, global workspace or something of this kind, right? It's an illuminated zone, a stage. There are things moving outside of it, but there's that stage. But to be the center in the totality is like the sun. Measuring with the sun at the center of the system makes the calculations of the planets almost trivially easy compared to adding epicycles onto a crazy orrery model the way that we used to have to, right? It cuts through a bunch of bullshit and makes it a lot easier to predict. Relative to the sun, if we want to figure out some other calculation, you want to figure out how the planets are moving relative to the galactic center, that's a different thing. And relativity, there is no real center. But for our purposes, the center of the psyche is the self. Well, it is both the center and the totality. So how is that? Well, it's the center insofar as it's the sort of highest mass value and therefore yields the easiest interpretation of those other systems. But it's the totality because of that sine qua non factor, right? We could still have a solar system if Saturn flew off into space, right? Probably that would create instabilities, but you get my point, right? Mercury could go. I mean, some people don't even think Mercury is a planet. I've heard a pretty good argument. Mercury is actually just, properly speaking, the moon of, the only moon of the sun, right? And we've had all this stuff. Demoting Pluto, for instance. Pluto doesn't count as a planet anymore. It's a dwarf planetoid. They should have been more careful because Pluto is, of course, the god of wealth. And as soon as they did that, the financial markets crashed in 2007. Coincidence? Anyway, I'm not an astrologer for reference. Okay, but you could theoretically lose some of those bodies and effectively the system would be the same. But if you pull the sun out of the equation, you don't have a solar system anymore. That doesn't mean that the sun is identical to the bodies orbiting it. It means the system only exists insofar as the sun centralizes. That's how I think about the self.
Mm.
It's the center and the totality, in the sense that without it, there is no system constituted. Maybe the individual elements might be there in some sense. I don't know what that would mean. But, how do I think about it if I'm not thinking about it in that kind of metaphorical sense? I think of the self, frankly, as being very similar, if not possibly identical to the kind of fundamental framing and relevance realization that John Vervaeke talks about. I think of it as the constituting process of cognition rather than the products of it, right? So this is sort of the idea that there is no self except self-organization, and that the self is it's the center of gravity for a self-organizing system within the brain and mind, right? Obviously, there are evolutionary kludges and lobes and, all sorts of things, right? Individual bits and pieces. But I think of it in that sense. It's like if there is sort of whatever, a phi field or integrated information or something of this kind, right? The overall system that in some sense, possibly non local way, because I still tend to think that consciousness is not localized to one piece or another. I think it's a whole brain kind of phenomenon. That self is in some sense the core organizing principle which constitutes it. And that would be consistent with sort of the Jungian descriptions, because the self would be the thing which processes before categories. It would supervene upon and be sort of beyond, above, precede category. Whereas the experience of categories, the world of opposites, starts to fall out after that. All of these other pieces exist in that world of opposites, right? And indeed, it's doing that work, the synthesis and integration of the opposites, that brings you in some sense closer and closer to the experience of the self. Mercurius, the child of God and the devil, right, who was both male and female, a mystic hermaphrodite and all this jazz, I think expresses a sort of asymptotic near point to that dissolution. And you can see trends of that in other religions, right? When we enter a state of non-duality, this is supposed to be in some sense more fundamental. And I think it literally is. We're getting closer and closer to a non-categorical, non-differentiated kind of experience, or as close as we can get. And yeah, sorry, at this point, words start to break down a little bit, but that's sort of the rough and ready. That is what the self is. It's the organized, it's the center, but also the totality, insofar as it's an organizing principle rather than the products of that process, which are maybe distinct and polarized and what have you.
On the topic, this has been really helpful for understanding the self and Carl Jung's model.
Okay. Good, because half the time I'm not sure I understand it. Anyway.
What do you think he meant by synchronicity?
That's a toughie. Okay. So, well, I mean, you know me, so you know that I have a particular position on metaphysics and epistemology, which is to say that I'm a militant agnostic. I believe deeply in holding things lightly, and in the sort of Gödelian sense, I have chosen to privilege completeness over consistency, while recognizing no free lunch hypothesis, that there are downsides to that. But it seems to me that lots of people who are doing rigorous work are, right, that their concept of rigor is tied to the concept of consistency, and necessarily any sufficiently complex system that's consistent has undecidable propositions and therefore is incomplete, or, right? It's a trade-off. You can't get away from it. So I privilege completeness. I am willing to accept that certain things may be experiences, even though I don't have the framework to incorporate them. And maybe they'll become consistent later, but I'm not hell-bent on that idea. You can have local domains. So all that said, I believe in holding things lightly. Multiple interpretations. So what do I think about synchronicity? What he means by synchronicity, when Jung and Pauli wrote, synchronicity and a-causal connecting principle. This came out of their personal correspondence and interaction and Pauli's analysis. And Pauli, of course, was at the time one of the leading, if not the leading, quantum physicists in the world. He was concerned with attempting to explain certain results that were highly counterintuitive that were coming out of early 20th century quantum mechanics, right? And quantum mechanics is an incomplete theory. We haven't unified it with gravity. There are still problems with it, but it does have the virtue of being the most accurate theory ever conceived by the human mind, in the sense that its predictive power is astounding, right? Albeit statistical, right? But it's astounding. It would be like throwing a baseball from New York to Los Angeles and predicting where the ball lands within a quarter of an inch. Like, it has a tremendous amount of precision. And the fact that that is the case, given law of large number, probability, underpins so much of our technology. Like, it's not really a question, right? The computers we're talking on would not function minus quantum mechanics, right? Even though it's an incomplete theory, et cetera, et cetera. So Pauli was trying to figure out certain things that were happening in quantum mechanics that were resistant to interpretation. And Jung, of course, was interested in both paranormal events to some extent, which it had a lot more respectability at the time because of people like J.B. Rhine, right? Parapsychological stuff. J.B. Rhine and people, like, there was a period where this had much more intellectual respectability. And then, in my opinion, what happened was the Soviets came out with their own material and the US shadow-othered it and was like, that's ridiculous. See, the Soviets are doing things that are ridiculous because the Cold War, and separated themselves. But behind the scenes, they were still funding a shitload of this stuff at the CIA and so on and so forth. This is all matter of public record. So clearly they weren't totally divorced from it. They just denounced it because the Soviets were doing it. Anyway, point being, Jung's interested in that. And then he's also interested in experiences of synchronicity that are meaningful coincidence. So the classic version of this that he relates is this thing where a woman who's really has a hard time breaking through to her emotional access. She's very tight, rational, whatever, is sitting there, and she has had this dream where she got a piece of jewelry, a brooch that was a scarab, right? So like an Egyptian scarab beetle. And as he relates, right, and there are some questions about how apocryphal this is, but it's a useful example. As he relates, she's going through this dream, she's talking about this scarab, whatever, and he hears a tippity tick 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 at his window. And so he goes to the window, and there's something like flying against the glass, and he opens it up, and in flies this insect, and he grabs it. And he realizes that it's a scarabate beetle, which is not, unheard of in Switzerland, but somewhat uncommon. It's basically the closest living thing that you might think of. It's sort of a brilliant green, iridescent, right? You can kind of imagine this sort of beetle. And so he goes to this woman and he says, here is your scarab. Now, it's interesting because then, of course, this is like a kind of experience, right? And when you have these kinds of experiences in analysis, I had some very striking ones when I was in analysis. So striking that even though I'm quite open, I'm the 99th percentile or something in openness, 98, 99, and I have a sort of an intellectual commitment, I went in and would relate things to my analyst to be like, I'm sympathetic to this, but what am I supposed to do with this? And his answer really, really stayed with me. And it's been central to my own practice, which is he was sort of nonchalant and said, after you've been doing this a while, you realize these things are happening all the time. And that is indeed consistent with my experience. But the point is meaningful coincidence. So there's some kind of inner state, and then you experience something outwards that seems to be reflective of that inner experience in a way that cannot be causally resolved, but seems too improbable to simply be random. So a lot of the time people discharge coincidence and they may, it's like, law of large numbers, or they reference sort of cognitive biases of various kinds. They're like, well, think about all the times you mentioned your grandma and she didn't call at that second. And there are all these things. And I think those things are important. They're an important kind of epistemological hygiene. However, in my experience, there are a subset of these things which, after you do that, when you run the back of the envelope calculations, you still get this residuum of things that are just like, what? And those are interesting. I mean, they're remarkable. For one thing, they seem to indicate a possible connection between mind and the world, right? Between mind and matter, which is not simply causal. And right, like it seems to be like a secret connection, right? Has that quality. It very often has this kind of like, it's as though the universe winked at you quality, which is fascinating. And in my experience, both with clients and reading sort of clinical histories around it and my own experience, it very often breaks through emotional blockages of various kinds. I've been in a very, very deep, depressed state sometimes, and had a synchronicity blast in that just shattered that instantly. Why? Because it seemingly pulled my attention to my participation in the world in some way that was not the conventional naturalistic sense of causal interaction, and therefore promptly reduced my sense of insignificance and powerlessness, right? And of course, fired my curiosity through the roof, because I would be like, how is that even possible? Right? How can that possibly be working? So Jung and Pauli come together and they're interested in these things, these coincidences, okay, and sort of paranormal things, very sort of on the pace. And Pauli is interested in quantum phenomena that seem to step outside of what we'd think of as normal causal mechanism. And so what they come up with is a unified notion of synchronicity, an A-causal connecting principle. Now, at the time, that was a pretty radical position. But A-causality was started to be formally predicted in things like entanglement, right, Bell inequality and such in 1964, 1965, something like that. It was formally proved, right? We saw actual A-causal influence in physics through the entanglement experiments of Alain Aspect, which is just an amazing name for a physicist doing quantum mechanics work. Your last name is Aspect? Shut up. We're in a simulation. But anyway, Aspect in the 90s did some of the early experiments, and now that shit is desktop, right? If you read about quantum teleportation, it's even if we overhaul our entire theory of quantum mechanics, right, which presumably we hope to do, we still have to account for A-causality. A-causality is simply a feature of the world which we observe. It's reproducible, it's predictable, it in fact, they're trying to use it technologically. So when they proposed this concept, A-causality, right, and synchronicity and A-causal connecting principle, that was pretty weird in some ways and really like against the grain. People did not like it. But the point I've been making for 25 years is as soon as you have one instance of the proposed phenomenon, that is the exceptionality which you need to then put it on the table. So the fact that A-causality clearly operates at some level within, right? A-causality operates within entanglement phenomena and other kinds of quantum phenomena, non-locality, etc. That means that concept is on the table. It means that causality is not the only game in town. That doesn't mean that synchronicities are caused by quantum mechanics or explainable in terms of quantum mechanics. They might be. Who knows? We don't know, right? Likewise, people get real miffy about the idea of there being some back channel sort of between mind and the world. Well, why? Guess what? We don't know how those things interact. It's called the hard problem. And, I worked in consciousness theory. I think we got some pretty good stuff. I don't even think we're close to cracking that, if it's crackable at all, right? So the connection between the mind and the world is up in the air, right? And A-causality is fully determinable. As a concept, it's on the table. So I see no problem with synchronicity, right? It's not a defensible thing. Now, this will be interesting. At this conference, I'm doing a conference in Poland, speaking at a conference in Poland, which the keynote is Ian McGilchrist. So I'm interested to meet Ian or Dr. McGilchrist. I should be respectful. But there's also a fellow who's talking, I think, back to back with me in one session, and his thing was like synchronicity. What is it? A concept without a metaphysic, or something of this kind. And so I'm going to be really interested to talk to him, because I don't think that's. I think we do have an underdeveloped sense of the metaphysic, but if the claim is going to be this makes no sense, I'm ready to get into it. I don't think that there are any sort of formal rational barriers against it. So that's the outline. When we're talking about synchronicity, what is it? I don't know. Nobody knows. The question is always, is this a reflective of an actual event in the world, or is it somehow an interior psychological event only? Right? Is this, and the standard naturalistic position is like, at some level, the claim is categories and patterns don't exist in the world, right? The universe doesn't care what you think, right? And does not exist in those ways, right? But it's incontrovertible that people have the experience. People definitely have the experience. There's no question about that, right? The only question is how to interpret that experience. And it seems to me that the experience has demonstrable effects. It has certain kinds of psychological effects on people. Now, that might be indicative of an internal mechanism, like, pareidolia or something of this kind, where under certain circumstances, the mind looks for meaningful pattern in order to increase its coherent sense of meaningful structure in the world. And so you experience that as a gee whiz wow, but actually it's just cherry picking on the part of your rational relevance realization system. That's sort of the dismiss argument. If that's the case, I say, yeah, okay, but what is it good for? Let's assume it's an entirely internal subjective experience that has no external validity. Yeah, okay, but what is it good for? And can it be increased? Right? Can we use it for something? And I would say the answer is yes, in both cases. I think it's profoundly useful psychologically for intentional self-development. And I think that we have a well-developed system, actually, around the world of increasing your experience of synchronicity. So, tag there. However, let's remain open for a second and say, what do we do with these sort of irreducible cases where they seem to be weird, where the back of the envelope, it's like, what are the odds? What are the odds? I mean, that's basically what you land on. What are the odds? And sometimes that's fooling us. We talked about love at first sight. What are the odds is a love at first sight. That's a standard cult of two kind of argument. Oh my God, what are the odds? Like, I decided to take a delayed flight, and so I sat beside Tom on the plane, and he got the corn on the cob, and I also got the corn on the cob. And then, as it turned out, he liked butter, and I like butter, and it's like we're made for each other. What are the odds? Sorry, no mocking. That's rude. But you hear what I'm saying, right? Sometimes we produce that sense of elevated meaning, and it certainly is present when we're in a state of romantic connection. To me, that's a clue that says it tells us something about how it works. And maybe it's just that we're juiced up on dopamine, so we see more patterns than normal, right? But there's always this irreducible residual, it seems to me. And for those, it's like, well, let's say for a second that these do represent something, given that we don't understand the relationship in question. The metaphysics are not settled by any stretch. Maybe there are back channel connections between mind and world. I think that there's plenty of reasons to think that might be true, right? Including, I add parapsychology, which is, I think, at the sort of in the better constructed end, is unfairly maligned, right? I think there's good work there, right? I think some of Daryl Bem's work is really interesting. I think the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Group work on micro PK is extremely suggestive, and they never succeeded in making the effect more than a tiny statistical deviation, but it was statistically significant across meta study. And like, what does that mean? We can move atoms by thinking about it. Like, at some level, that sounds like it breaks with science, but science is, of course, radically incomplete. in terms of providing a metaphysics for many things in our experience. So I think that means that if we can't explain it, and if it happens all the time, and if there is a potential explanation which is not logically impermissible, as people once would have said A-Causality was, right? If that's on the table, well, then why not? Maybe. And the best way to do that, I mean, the problem with these things is repeatability a lot of the time. But we also have techniques and mechanisms for increasing the experience of synchronicity. And that brings me to, I guess, my pitch for magic, which basically that's what I think. Magic is in no small part a set of psychotechnologies which increases synchronicity.
I want to know more about that. But it's interesting you talking about the metaphysics of almost what worldview would explain something like this. I guess Bernardo Kastrup, an idealist, kind of goes, well, everything is mind. But I've talked to also Alicia Huero, doing, context matters, constraints, everything causes everything in certain systems in certain ways. So, we want to go, we want to do bottom up reductionists, there's only tiny little things and they're the only things that matter. But obviously, real entities are ourself. We just talked about in the Jungian sense, our totality, but also the families, the communities we're in. So just scale that up out to the whole world. And then it just makes me think, and we can get into what magic is and its relation to synchronicity. It's like, given that the world is so complicated, yet we're interconnected with it, right? How do we navigate it? Given that to find meaning in our life and to,
Yeah, I mean, that's a big set of questions. I don't know if we'll necessarily have the time to get into magic today, although I am, as I said, happy to talk about it. And happy to talk again, not to self-invite, but if you want to talk again, or I can have you on my side or whatever, happy to talk about it. It's what I spend most of my time thinking about these days in terms of my intellectual work, so, is magic. And actually, full disclosure, I am a practitioner, a long-term practitioner of magic. I've been practicing magic basically actually since about the same time as I got into Jung, since I was about 12. Half-assed before that, but seriously since about then. And again, I'm a dilettante. It goes through waves. But coming back into it, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it as psychotechnology, thinking about it together with other sort of sapiential psychotechnologies, wisdom producing, right? Mindfulness, et cetera, right? John's deal logos, right? I'm very concerned with things like ritual. I'm very concerned with how altered states plug into this, et cetera, et cetera. And my basic position on it is I don't need to know what the ultimate explanation and metaphysical ground of the phenomenon is. I simply need to recognize first that the phenomenon does occur. And then second, it's like, okay, can I, in some sense, alter, produce, right? Change the probability curve of getting one of these things, right? Because they pop off unpredictably, somewhat. And then third is, and what is the potential utility of that? I'm a big believer in the no free lunch hypothesis. Every tool has a thing under the bell curve that is its utility as a heuristic, and an equal thing under the line in which it is a bias. So there are unquestionably circumstances where synchronicity is damaging or deleterious, right? Synchronicities going off like that is often a feature of psychosis, right? And I've experienced psychosis briefly. Well, some people might disagree, but I've experienced that, and it can be a deeply frightening situation, right? Too much meaning is not good. People think you want, turn up the dial, more meaning. That is not true. Anybody who has spent the night banging their way through a 14-hour LSD trip will tell you that the next day you don't want any excess meaning. You just want your shoes to sit there, not deliver a sermon. You just want your oatmeal to be oatmeal. You want things to be just basic and simple and not charged with significance and depth. So there are certainly circumstances where, more signification, more symbolism, more synchronicity is not better. But there are also cases where we are dealing with a deficit in our sense of connection to the world, right? Connect this to John's premise around the meaning crisis. Meaning crisis is this sort of deep disembedding from the world, right? Where we've separated ourselves both theoretically through constructs of science, et cetera, through knocking down all of the social institutions we had, where we had the psychotechnologies to have the felt sense of connection, right? We sort of trashed all that on our way through. And now people feel this deep gap and a horrific metaphysic, right? The metaphysic that they experience is awful, right? It's atoms in the void, or blindly struggling selfish genes, and right, omitting any of the levels above that. Love's not real, it's just chemicals. This is the thing I hear with distressing regularity, and it's like, I don't know, man. If it launched 1,000 ships, it seems pretty real to me. Like, what else? How else do you want to? Well, that doesn't count, because that's not what really happened, right? And as you mentioned, right, Kastrup's, what's his line? Materialism is baloney, right? There's a privileging there that's going on that doesn't get examined. So the point is, people feel separated. They feel insignificant. They feel a state of meaninglessness, or like their meaning is not reflected in the world. All these various things. Synchronicity cuts through that shit like a hot knife. And maybe it's not reflective of an actual state. Maybe it's a psychological clutch. Maybe we can say the same thing about the experience of God, right? The experience of God is indistinguishable from an actual experience of God. That's Jung's whole point, right? And it's one of the most brilliant things I think he ever said. It's like, how would you tell the difference? An experience with the self is indistinguishable. So, right? And honestly, even if it is just an interior psychological thing, if you have an experience with the self, this is the thing which constitutes the figure and ground and structuring of all your experience and all possible states of altered states of identity, altered states of construal, altered states of attention, altered states. I mean, what else is this? Like, even if magic isn't chucking fireballs or Harry Pottering around on a broom, okay, if your experience can be altered in that way, and if you can have encounters that radically break through things that are causing you to be morose or nihilistic or detached from the world, if you can selectively have experiences that enliven, invigorate, and re-enchant, but in a more controlled fashion, that to me seems like its own good. And if it turns out that has a connection to a deeper metaphysical truth, well, it seems like it's going to be much easier to reach that if we can more reliably access those states in order to run science on them. So it seems like a no-brainer to me that we should be doing magic.
Okay, for next time, we need to do that.
For next time.
Where can people find you? Point them to your work.
Right. If people are interested, I mean, the best place, and if you want to throw a link up, is my YouTube channel. There's 100 and some hours, including our past conversation, is linked there in talks/interviews. It's one of the sub regions, but you can watch all my classes are up there for free. And then it's also just me talking about stuff with people of this kind. I enjoy doing it. That's probably the best starting place to kind of look. And then as we were talking about right at the outset, I am still piddling around. For anybody who still remembers me mentioning this, I've been working on this thing called Opus for like years. It may be that this is the albatross that drags me to the bottom of the sea. I don't know. But the idea is I'm attempting, and I've been putting together the equipment to release a long form series of episodes, right? Individual episodes across time, which try to tie much of what we're talking about together into a theoretical and practical framework and to run plausibility arguments. So it's an attempt to sort of synthesize where I'm at 47, which is a prime number. So it seems like a good time for it. Here's where I'm at for now. So I'm working on that. I've been getting cameras set up and mics and whatever. This is not a natural field for me, but I've been writing on that scripting. So I'm hoping that will be somewhat forthcoming. But yeah, my YouTube channel is probably the best place to get to know what I'm about.
I like that you called it Opus. This is good luck. I'm looking forward to it. Your channel is so good.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. We'll see. It's a daunting task. John Vervaeke is a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, and I was involved in the production of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. In fact, he's filming it. If you look, those episodes are filmed in the boardroom, which is down the hall from my old consulting office, my clinical office. I booked them the space and we set up, or whatever. We used to play D&D in there. Not when we were filming, but otherwise. John, as he always does, sets a daunting bar, right? And it's not to say that I feel that I'm in competition with him, but that he establishes a certain standard. I'm not John. We're not interested in identical things. My mode is different than his. I'm frankly weirder than he is, and he is far more interested in a kind of consistency. And I'm just like, look, here's 19 weird things plus Bigfoot and Elvis. Go. But I'm hoping that I can pull it together. And so, yeah, we shall see. We shall see. But anyway, thank you again. It is always a pleasure to talk to you, Jack, and I really appreciate your having me on. And I hope we get the opportunity to continue this conversation at some point.
Thank you. Yes. You owe me a conversation on ritual and magic. So.
Okay. Well, I could talk about that all day.
Yes.
So you should be careful what you wish for.